All right, so let's talk today about red meat. Over the last several decades, eating red meat has come under some scrutiny from mainstream media outlets and medical organizations alike. Now, it's a pretty common conversation that I'm having in the office with folks about what's their goal as far as diet. And a lot of people make a comment about, I've been trying to watch my red meat. I'm cutting back on my red meat. My doctor told me that I shouldn't eat red meat, and I feel like I'm doing pretty good about that. And there's plenty of reasons for this, citing health reasons, ethical, moral reasons, environmental reasons, and we're just really going to kind of try to address the health reasons today. But we'd really like to talk today about kind of how these comments in passing from doctors over the years are, at this stage in the game, more akin to old wives' tales than solid, undisputed scientific evidence. So that's be our goal for today. All right, myth number 1. Red meat will raise my cholesterol. This one is the big one. And I always like to start off with first, the U.S. Dietary Guidelines removed its decade-long recommendation to limit dietary cholesterol in 2015. They just didn't let anybody know. And that was because of a lack of substantial evidence that your increase of dietary cholesterol had any impact in your blood cholesterol levels. And even the American Heart Association in 2013 cited insufficient evidence to determine whether lowering dietary cholesterol could reduce LDL. So we have likely oversimplified and incorrectly that if you eat more cholesterol, your blood cholesterol goes up. Even if that were the case, red meat contains almost equivalent amounts of cholesterol than the healthier alternative white meats, such as chicken and pork. And actually, lean ground beef has less cholesterol than equivalent servings of pork tenderloin or chicken with no skin. So if you're trying to say, I have a cholesterol problem, my doctor told me that my lipid panel has red numbers on it, and we need to fix those red numbers immediately, we need to kind of really reevaluate what's driving that change in the blood, because it's not as simple as eating less cholesterol. We've made that way too simple. The second myth, myth number 2, red meat is inflammatory. While maybe 10 times less than a wild-caught king salmon, grass-fed and finished beef has much more omega-3 fatty acid than conventional beef and has an overall favorable omega-3 to omega-6 ratio. And what we're talking about when we're talking about omega-3, omega-6 ratio is the reason that we think olive oil is healthy is because it has this omega-3 fatty acid, which is anti-inflammatory. And these omega-6 fatty acids seem to be, if we're oversimplifying it, pro-inflammatory as far as in the body, in the blood vessels. So when you change your beef from conventionally fed beef, which actually in this country, most cattle farming is going to be, the life cycle of these cows is going to be mostly on grass anyhow, because of the way, as opposed to other conventionally raised meat in this country like chicken or pork, which are living a much more unnatural life cycle as far as their grain structure. But nonetheless, if you get a fully grass-fed, grass-finished beef, it's going to be less inflammatory, at least in terms if we're making that judgment based on the omega-3 to omega-6 ratio. And we should take into account that many alternatives to beef are meats with worse omega-3 to omega-6 ratio because of the food structure that we just mentioned. And that omega-3, omega-6 ratio also comes into play when we're talking about plant foods like legumes, nightshades, nuts, and seeds that seem to be inflammatory on individual and case-by-case basis. So the reason I bring that up is because if you're trying to reduce your red meat intake and substituting it for these other things, and you start having big-time issues, whether that's bowel issues, joint pains, you need to be examining some of these other highly inflammatory foods on a case-by-case basis, anecdotally from people who have removed legumes, nightshades, nuts, and seeds from their diet and start to do better in terms of those things. So It's way too individualized to make a sweeping declaration that red meat is more inflammatory than other foods. So always just remember that you know your body better than anybody else, and you have to do it. Myth number 3, red meat will give me bowel cancer. This was a pretty hot topic 2 or 3 years ago. There was a study from the Internal Agency for Research on Cancer stating that red meat was a carcinogen. And this becomes a really loaded question. It's a big-time conversation about what this means. But the easiest thing to say is that to start, we should mention that processed red meat was probably higher implicated as a carcinogen. So we're talking about anything that gets ground, put in a case, cured, smoked, has highly processed agents in it. Those things did seem to have a higher risk. But it's important to talk about risk. This scientific concept in statistics about the relative risk versus absolute risk. So absolute risk says that there's a certain percent of people in a country at any given time, for any reason whatsoever, is going to get bowel cancer. And that is the absolute risk. So then when we talk about relative risk, we take that subset of people and say, okay, if these people eat red meat on top of their baseline risk for developing bowel cancer, will their risk increase? And in this case, will it increase if they're eating red meat? So that's the concept of relative risk. So in these studies, people who ate more red meat relative to people who did not did have a higher percentage of colorectal cancer. But compared to the baseline risk of developing cancer across a lifespan in a particular country, the percent difference was much smaller. Not to mention that anytime we're talking about dietary research or nutrition research, all of this is usually epidemiological studies, which is rife with confounding variables, such as healthy user bias and many other things that makes it incredibly hard to control what were these folks eating that would also, with their red meat, that could contribute to increased risk of colorectal cancer. So sometimes we talk about, there's a huge difference probably between eating a steak and eating a drive-through hamburger that you're eating. If, let's say, you ate the same amount of meat at that meal, but you also ate fries and drank a diet soda or whatever it is, it's going to be really hard for us to tease out in very large studies and control for those factors. So I think the best that we can say at this point in time is that the jury's still out. And just like everything else in medicine, it comes down to individual risk versus benefit analysis that is in line with your personal preference and belief system. That's like everything in medicine. Drugs, supplements, diet. You have to look at the individual risk versus the benefits in your life with your personal belief system and go from there. And your role of your provider, your doctor, your physician should be trying to craft a plan that supports your patient preferences and belief system. Myth number 4, red meat is bad for the environment. I cannot elaborate on the contribution of the commercial food or the industrial food system to our environment, as well as Barbara Kingslover's book, Animal Vegetable Miracle. Rob Wolf and Diana Rogers have done some amazing work highlighting in their most recent documentary about how cattle farming in this country really has the ability to regenerate portions of our American grassland. And of course, some of our favorites, like Joel Salatin, and many even here locally, our farmers can speak to how the sustainable carbon cycling of regenerative agricultural practices. So sometimes it becomes a macro versus micro. It would be hard to deny some of these folks that are doing a lot of this work on regenerative agriculture, saying that those folks are being harmful to the environment. Certainly, kind of a big point in Animal Vegetable Miracle is this idea that especially if you look at that meat production at a local level and say that the alternative is eating soybeans that have been flown across oceans, shipped in shipping containers and processed and then driven in trucks across America, then you start to reevaluate kind of. Last thing I want to say is notice that we've not talked anything about, I'm not telling you to eat red meat. That is not what I'm trying to do. I eat beef, I like lamb, venison, bison, foods that I'm trying to put into my diet for health reasons. But I'm not telling you that you should. Meat, red meat, no meat, it's your choice. We're here to support that. However, if you are at home right now restricting your red meat consumption because of some of the things that were mentioned earlier, some things that you've heard or been told that may not be totally true, you may have more options. You don't have to feel as guilty, possibly, about eating beef. And I want to make it clear, I'm making no claims or stakes about ethical or religious reasons why somebody wouldn't eat red meat. I totally respect any creed, code, religion, or moral stance that says that you have an ethical or religious obligation to not eat, not just red meat, but any meat. So